My nephew burst into the study, his face pale, just as I was about to leave for the auction. He pulled my hand down, whispering in French, his voice trembling almost to the point of being inaudible. "Grandpa, don't get in the car, it's going to explode." I froze, still buttoning my coat. Just then, my butler appeared in the door, smiling as if nothing had happened. If you found this channel today, I'm glad you did. Tell me in the comments, what city or country are you joining from? That small thing means more than you know. Quick note, some elements of this story are fictional, added to serve the narrative and the lesson inside it. Names and settings are not drawn from any specific person or place. But everything this story is trying to tell you is worth hearing. The study on the upper floor of Ashford Manor had always been my favorite room in the house. Not because of the walnut desk that Margaret picked out at an estate sale in Marin County back in 1991. Not because of the floor-to-ceiling glass wall that looked out over the garden where the old camellia trees were just beginning to drop their first autumn leaves onto the brick path below. It was my favorite room because at precisely this hour, 7:15 in the morning, when the October sun came through the tall windows at a low angle and turned everything the color of warm honey, the world outside stopped demanding anything from me. I sat down, set my coffee cup on the leather coaster Margaret had embroidered with my initials C.A. for Cornelius Ashford, though nobody had called me Cornelius since my mother passed, and reached into the top right drawer of the desk. My hand found the box without looking. After 4 years, my fingers knew the exact weight of it, the give of the velvet against my palm, the way the brass hinge resisted just slightly before it yielded. The blue velvet box opened. 3 stones rested in their worn silk cradles, the same way they had rested every morning for 4 years. I never took them out. I never rearranged them. I simply looked. The first was the sapphire, a deep, saturated blue that pulls light in rather than throwing it back. Margaret had described it once on a rainy afternoon, cataloging the estate collection together as the exact color of the sky above Grant Park the day we met. I had been 26. She had been standing beside a fountain in a yellow coat, arguing with someone on a payphone, completely unaware that a man she had not yet spoken to was already certain he was going to marry her. I never told her that until our 30th anniversary dinner. She laughed and said she already knew. The second was a pearl not perfectly round, slightly off axis, with the soft luminescence that only real saltwater pearls carry. It had come from the strand she wore on our wedding day, a necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. One pearl worked loose during the reception and rolled under a table at the Drake Hotel in Chicago. A busboy found it and returned it the next morning. She kept it separate from the rest ever since in this box, because she said a pearl that survives a wedding night deserves its own place. The third was amber golden translucent, with a tiny suspended bubble frozen near its center like a breath the world had taken and never let out. She had picked it up off a beach in Maine during our honeymoon, bent down without breaking stride, held it to the sun, and said, "Neil, look, someone trapped a piece of summer in here." I had thought it was a beautiful thing to say. I still did. 4 years since Margaret died. Pancreatic cancer, swift and indifferent the way that particular disease tends to be. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Not enough time to say everything which I had since learned was always true, regardless of how much time you had. I looked at the 3 stones in the morning light and let myself be still. This was the only moment in any given day that I allowed myself to do that completely. No agenda, no calls to return, no decisions about Ashford gemstone before 9 o'clock. Just the sapphire, the pearl, the amber, and the particular quality of early October light in Pacific Heights. San Francisco light in autumn has a gentleness that the city's reputation does not prepare you for. I closed the box, set it back in the drawer, reached for my coffee. Tonight was the Blue Ashford auction at the Fairmont Hotel on Nob Hill, the largest charitable event Ashford Gemstone had mounted in 11 years. The centerpiece lot, a $45 million matched diamond suite my team had spent nearly 2 years assembling, was scheduled for 8 o'clock. Proceeds designated for 3 children's literacy foundations across California. Journalists coming. Collectors flying in from New York and London. My operations director had sent 3 separate reminder emails before 6 this morning, each slightly more urgent than the last. I reached for my vest and began working the first button through its hole. That was when I heard its small feet moving fast in the upstairs hallway. Not the careful steps of someone trying not to wake anyone, but the urgent barefoot slap of a child who had somewhere to be immediately. The sound got louder, stopped outside my door. The door opened. Theo stood in the doorway in his pajamas, the blue ones with small rocket ships he had picked out himself at the Macy's on Union Square last month. 6 years old and small for his age with his mother. Vivien's dark hair and inexplicably Margaret's green eyes, the same unusual shade that had reappeared in this family once a generation, as if Margaret had quietly arranged it. His face was the color of the pearl in my drawer. He crossed the room in 4 steps, both hands wrapped around my forearm with a grip tighter than a 6-year-old's had any reasonable business being. He pulled not hard, but with the insistence of someone who needed me lower. I leaned down. He put his lips close to my ear. What he said in French. His voice was barely a sound, more breath than word, thin and trembling, the way a voice gets when the body is frightened, but the mind has decided it still has something it must say. "Grandfather, don't get in. The car is going to explode." I stayed where I was, bent at the waist. My right hand was still raised, one button half-threaded through its hole, and it simply stopped there. In 30 years of building Ashford Gemstone from a single storefront in the Diamond District into a company worth several $100 million, no hostile takeover, no failed negotiation, no market collapse had ever stopped my hands that way. I had learned to keep moving forward regardless, because in business and in grief, stopping is the thing that kills you. But the whisper of a 6-year-old boy in a language I had not taught him and could not account for had done what nothing else ever managed. It stopped me completely. What I did not yet know, standing in that study with the morning light, still warm on the walnut desk, and Margaret's stones settled in their velvet cradles, one drawer below, was that Theo's 4 words were not the beginning of this story. They were the moment I finally started paying attention to a story that had already been running for a very long time without me. The hallway outside my study was narrow and dark. At that hour, the kind of narrow that a Victorian house wears like a personality trait, all close walls and low ceilings, and the faint smell of old wood that no amount of renovation ever quite argues away. I stepped out of the study and pulled the door halfway shut behind me. If Vivien came up the stairs, I wanted it to look like nothing in particular was happening. 2 people standing in a hallway. A grandfather and his grandson. Ordinary Tuesday morning business. I went down on one knee so that my face was level with Theo's. Up close, I could see what I had not fully registered in the study. His eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet, but the kind of wet that happens when a child has been holding something frightening inside. For long enough that the body starts making decisions the mind hasn't approved yet. I kept my voice the way I kept it in boardrooms when the numbers on the table were bad, and I needed the room to stay calm, even, unhurried. The voice that said, "Whatever this is, we can handle it. Tell me everything, Theo," I said. "Every single word you heard. Take your time." He took a breath, then another. Then he told me. He had woken up earlier than usual, before Mrs. Daly came to start breakfast, before the house had properly shifted into its daytime version of itself. He had taken his toy down to the back garden, a remote-controlled robot that I had ordered for him from a specialty shop in Berkeley, the one he had named Agent 7, and declared the lead investigator of an ongoing espionage operation that existed entirely in his imagination and occasionally required my desk as a surveillance headquarters. He liked the back garden in the early morning, he said, because the dew made the grass look silver, and Agent Seven's wheels left tracks. He had been crouched behind the climbing roses near the south garden wall, playing in French, he told me carefully, because Agent Seven was currently undercover in Paris when he heard the voice. It was coming from the side passage, the narrow, covered walkway that ran between the main house and the garage, out of sight from where Theo was kneeling in the grass. A man's voice, low and deliberate, the kind of low that is not accidental. Someone speaking that way has chosen to speak that way. He spoke in French. Theo caught the words, because as he explained to me with the particular solemnity of a 6-year-old delivering important information he had been practicing. His teacher, Miss Rousseau, at the language school on Sacramento Street, where I had enrolled him 2 years ago, had told him last week that he had the sharpest ears in the class. I had put Theo in that school when he was 4 years old. Margaret had suggested it actually in one of our last long conversations, when she was already too tired to sit up for most of the day, but still wanted to talk about what the children in this family would need when they grew up. Give Theo a window, Neil, she had said. Another language is another way of seeing. I had agreed, the way I always agreed with Margaret, when she said things I recognized as true, and I had written the check the following week without thinking much more about it. Standing in that hallway, I understood for the first time that some decisions protect you in ways you cannot see when you make them. The sentence Theo had heard repeated back to me with the careful precision of a child who understood he was carrying something fragile. Was this the order will be carried out when the engine warms up? And then a name, said once clearly. Mr. Mercer. Sebastian. I stayed very still on one knee. The hallway felt smaller than it had 30 seconds ago. Are you absolutely certain about those words? I asked. Every one of them. Theo looked at me with the steady, slightly offended expression that children deploy when adults question something they are sure of. Pskiania, grandfather. He said, you have been paying for French school since I was 4. Miss Rousseau says I have the sharpest ears in the class. He paused. I was also taking very detailed notes in my head. He added, because Agent Seven's mission log requires accurate field reports. Under any other circumstance, I would have smiled at that. I filed it away instead. From somewhere beyond the far end of the hallway, I heard Vivien's bedroom door open. The soft sound of her moving toward the bathroom. The familiar morning sequence of someone who has lived in a house long enough to move through it without thinking. She would be downstairs within 10 minutes, possibly less. I put both hands on Theo's shoulders lightly, the way you hold something you do not want to frighten. You did exactly the right thing, I told him. You were brave and you were smart and you did everything correctly. I looked at him steadily. Now I need you to do one more brave thing. I need you to go downstairs, eat breakfast, and act completely normal. Can you do that for me? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Even if I don't feel normal, especially then, that's what agents do. He straightened his shoulders visibly, deliberately, and nodded once. I stood up, and that was when I heard it from the floor below, footsteps crossing the entryway, the particular sound of polished shoes on the marble near the base of the staircase. I looked down over the banister. Dorian Laval was crossing toward the front door, tablet in hand, dressed in his customary dark jacket. His morning-ready expression, arranged with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing households like this one for a long time. He glanced up at the movement above him and offered the easy, open smile he wore every morning, without variation. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," he said. "The car is ready whenever you are." I held the banister with one hand and looked down at him, at the smile, at the calm, at the absolute ordinary surface of a man I had seen every day for 3 years and thought I understood completely. "Thank you, Dorian," I said. "Give me 10 minutes." He nodded and moved toward the side hallway. The door closed behind him with a quiet, final sound. I had hired Dorian Laval 3 years ago, on a personal recommendation, a strong one offered without hesitation by Sebastian. Standing at the top of my own staircase, watching the space where Dorian had just been, I felt something shift in the architecture of everything I thought I knew about my household. For the first time, I understood that I had never actually known who Dorian Laval was. What I still did not know, what I would not know until much later, was that the man smiling up at me from my own entryway was only the first piece of something far larger and far older than a Tuesday morning in October. The dining room at Ashford Manor caught the morning sun differently than the rest of the house, where my study collected light slowly, the way a careful man collects his thoughts. The dining room simply let it in, wide and generous, through the east-facing windows, landing across the oak table in long, warm rectangles that made even an ordinary Tuesday feel, for a few minutes at least, like something worth sitting down for. I came down the stairs at my usual pace. Not slower, not faster. The kind of pace that belongs to a man who slept well and has a full day ahead of him and no particular reason to rush. I had learned this, how to wear a mourning, the same way I had learned most of the useful things in my life, which was by watching what happened when you failed to do it well. The smell of coffee reached me before I reached the bottom step. Dark roast, the Ethiopian blend that Mrs. Daly ordered from a small importer on Valencia Street. Bread in the toaster. The particular domestic warmth of a house that does not yet know what day it actually is. Sebastian was already at the table. He was seated at the far end, the Wall Street Journal held in both hands, at the angle of a man who reads with genuine interest rather than performed attention. He had dressed early gray suit, no tie, yet the jacket draped over the back of his chair in a way that managed to look both casual and deliberate. He had always been good at that. The ease that costs work. Vivien was beside him with her coffee cup and her phone scrolling through something news or her inbox or perhaps the morning messages from her studio team. She looked up when I entered and gave me the small, warm smile she had inherited from nobody on my side of the family, and which I had therefore always suspected was entirely her own. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, sweetheart." Theo was at the corner of the table with his bowl of cereal, moving the spoon in slow circles. He did not look up when I came in. He was quiet noticeably, so if you were paying the right kind of attention, but quiet in the way that a child sometimes is in the morning. The way that reads as tiredness rather than anything else. He was doing well. Better than I had any right to expect. Dorian was at the sideboard arranging the second coffee service with the unhurried competence that had impressed me when I first hired him 3 years ago, on the strength of a recommendation that I was currently revising my opinion of. I sat down, poured my coffee, cut a slice of bread from the loaf on the board, and applied butter with the patience of a man who is thinking about something else, but refuses to show it. Outside the east window in the side garden where the camellia trees grew against the stone wall, I could see Edmund Groves moving among the climbing roses with his pruning shears. He worked the way he always worked, methodically, unhurried, his large and calloused hands, finding each branch with the kind of certainty that comes from doing one thing well for a very long time. Edmund had been with this house for 30 years. He had started as a mechanic. Actually had run a small repair shop in the Sunset District before a back injury changed the trajectory of his life and brought him, by a route I had never fully understood, to the garden of a Pacific Heights estate. Margaret had hired him. She had seen something in the way he tended to things that needed tending, and she had been right about him the way she was right about most people. I watched him work for perhaps 3 seconds longer than was necessary. Then I reached for my phone. I read nothing on the screen, but I let my expression do what the expression of a man reading an unexpected message does: a slight shift of focus, a faint drawing together of the brows, the look that says not a crisis, but something that requires attention. I set the phone down. "Patterson just messaged me," I said, keeping my voice at the level of mild inconvenience rather than concern. "She wants to meet 30 minutes early. Something about the sequencing of the Blue Ashford lot. Apparently one of the international bidders called in a question about the provenance certification, and she wants to walk through it before the evening briefing. Vivien looked up from her phone. This morning, apparently. I set down my coffee cup and looked at Dorian. Leave the rolls in the garage today, Dorian. I'll take the VIP car, getting the Silver Shadow through Pacific Heights. At this hour is more trouble than it's worth. And Ed mentioned last week that he wanted to do a full mechanical inspection before the next formal event. Let him start today. He'll have the time. Through the window, Edmund's shears moved steadily through another branch. He had not heard any of this. He did not need to. Dorian received the instruction the way he received all instructions, with a smooth, professional inclination of the head and a courteous, "Of course, Mr. Ashford." But in the half-second before the professional mask fully settled, something moved across his face. It was quick a compression, almost involuntary there and gone before any reasonable person would have registered it. I registered it because I was watching for it. Sebastian lowered his newspaper. Sound thinking. He said, his tone exactly calibrated to friendly and nothing more. That car draws attention regardless of where you take it. Good luck tonight, Neil. He picked up the journal again. The movement was perfectly smooth. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and crossed to where Vivien was sitting. I touched her shoulder, bent down, and kissed her on the cheek. The Tuesday morning goodbye, unremarkable and small, the way 1,000 Tuesday morning goodbyes had been before this one. Don't wait up if it runs late, I said. I never do, she said. She was already looking back at her phone. She was smiling. I went to Theo. He looked up when I reached him. Those green eyes, Margaret's eyes, steadier than any 6-year-old's eyes, had a right to be this morning. I put one arm around his shoulders and pulled him into a brief hug, the kind that looks like simple affection, and I leaned down so that my mouth was beside his ear. Be good today, secret agent, I said. Under the table out of sight, his small hand found my wrist and held it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he let go. He did not say anything. He simply nodded once and picked up his spoon again. I straightened up, retrieved my jacket from the hook near the door, and walked out of my own house without looking back. The VIP car was already waiting at the curb, black, quiet engine running. I got in, gave the driver the address on California Street, and settled back against the seat as the car moved forward and the iron gate began to swing open. I looked in the rearview mirror once. Dorian was standing in the doorway of my house. He was watching the car leave, not moving, not waving, simply watching with the still, patient attention of someone waiting to confirm something. And in the moment before the gate closed completely, I saw his right hand move to the inside pocket of his jacket and come out with his phone. He was already dialing before the gate shut. 4 blocks from Ashford Manor, I told the driver to pull over. He found a gap at the curb between a dry cleaner and a florist that had not yet opened for the day, and I paid in cash. I had started carrying cash again that morning, without consciously deciding, to the way the body sometimes makes preparations before the mind has finished thinking. I got out, shut the door, and stood on the sidewalk while the car moved back into traffic and disappeared around the corner of Sacramento Street. The morning was cool and still. Leaves on the liquidumbar trees along the block had turned at the edges the particular rust and gold that October manages in the better neighborhoods of San Francisco, where the trees are old enough to do it properly. A woman was walking a retriever on the far side of the street. 2 men in work clothes were loading something into a truck 2 doors down, everyone moving through their ordinary Tuesday. I turned and walked back the way I had come. Not on the main street. I went left at the first cross block, then right through the service lane that runs behind the properties on this stretch of Pacific Heights. The narrow, paved alley that most people in these houses use for trash collection and deliveries and nothing else. I knew it well. I had walked it dozens of times over the years, early in the mornings when I needed to think and did not want to be recognized on the main road. At the far end of the lane, where the Ashford property meets the stone wall of the neighboring estate, there is a wooden gate, It was installed in 1987, the year before we bought the house, and it had been quietly falling off its hinges ever since. Every contractor who came through suggested we replace it. Margaret always said she would get to it next season. She never did, and after she died, I found I could not bring myself to change it either, which is not a rational position for a man who makes his living on the precise management of valuable things. But grief is not particularly interested in rational positions. I pushed the gate open. The hinge complained the way it always complained and then yielded. The sound of pruning shears reached me before I was fully through, steady, rhythmic. The particular sound of someone who has been doing the same work long enough that the tool has become an extension of the hand, rather than a thing the hand is holding. I followed the sound along the south wall past the camellia trees and the stone bird bath that had been in this garden longer than I had, until I found Edmund Groves at the north wall, working his way methodically through the climbing roses. He heard me coming and looked up. His face did what it always did when it registered something unexpected. A brief stillness, an assessment, and then a return to whatever expression the situation seemed to require. Edmund had the face of a man who had decided a long time ago not to waste energy on reactions he hadn't verified yet. I stood and watched him for a moment, his hands large, scarred across the knuckles, the skin thickened and slightly discolored in the way that years of mechanical work leaves its mark on a person moved the shears through another branch. Clean cut, no hesitation. Those hands had spent 15 years inside engines before they ever touched a garden. Edmund had run a repair shop in Monterey Heritage Motors down near the Cannery Row end of town, the kind of place that attracted vintage car owners who cared more about authenticity than turnaround time. He had rebuilt carburetors for things that hadn't been manufactured since Eisenhower was president. He had a particular affinity for British cars, for the engineering philosophy that treated mechanical systems as things meant to last indefinitely if properly attended to. 25 years ago, he had found the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow in a deteriorating estate sale in Atherton, not running, not presentable, the kind of wreck that auctions price by the pound rather than by the vehicle, and he had brought it back. Took him 14 months and a level of patience that I still find difficult to fully conceptualize. Every component inspected, every system rebuilt from its constituent parts outward. The car that sat in my garage now was his work as much as it was Rolls-Royce's. He knew every bolt under that chassis. He knew what belonged there and what did not. 6 months ago, on a rainy April afternoon, when Theo was staying for the week and the garden was too wet for anything useful, I had been sitting at my desk, trying to review quarterly numbers, while Theo sat cross-legged on the floor with Agent 7, the remote-controlled robot that I had ordered from a specialty shop in Berkeley, and which had immediately become the centerpiece of an elaborate, ongoing espionage narrative that existed primarily in his imagination. He had asked me to help him mount a small infrared camera to the robot's front, housing the kind of camera designed for home security monitoring, no larger than a thumb. "Do you think Agent 7 could catch real bad guys someday, grandfather?" I had laughed. Genuinely, fully laughed, the kind that comes up without permission. I had told him that Agent 7 was already the most accomplished investigator in the Pacific Heights district, and that his career prospects were excellent. Standing at the North Garden wall now, I could not find that laugh anywhere. I set it aside. "Ed," I said. He looked up. "I need you to check under the rolls, every inch of the undercarriage." I kept my voice level. "You restored that car. You've been under it more times than anyone alive. If there's anything under there that wasn't there when you last inspected it, anything that doesn't belong, you'll know." Edmund set the shears down on the garden wall. He did not ask why. He did not ask what I expected to find, or whether I had contacted anyone else, or what had happened that morning to bring me back through the rear gate in my auction day vest, with that particular set to my jaw. He had known me long enough to understand that when I spoke in that specific register, quiet, direct, no preamble, I was not opening a conversation. I was making a request that needed to be honored immediately. He picked up his work jacket from the wall and walked toward the garage without another word. The The garage was cool and dim-smelling of motor oil and the particular mustiness of enclosed spaces that are well-maintained, but not frequently used. The silver shadow sat in the center under the overhead lights, silver-gray, immaculate. The car that was supposed to carry me to the Fairmont and back today. Edmund found a heavy-duty flashlight on the shelf near the door without having to look for it. He lowered himself to the concrete floor with the careful deliberateness of a man whose back has opinions about certain movements, and he slid under the car. I stood and waited. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. 5 minutes, perhaps, slightly less. The flashlight beam moved in small, methodical arcs. Edmund made no sound except the occasional shift of his body against the floor. Then the movement stopped. He stayed still for a long moment, long enough that I took a step forward. Then he slid out from under the car and stood up slowly, one hand braced against the chassis. He was pale in a way I had never seen Edmund Groves be pale before. He looked at me. He did not look away. "Mr. Ashford." His voice was completely flat. "There is something under there. Something that was not there the last time I inspected this vehicle." The fluorescent lights hummed above us. Somewhere outside, the pruning shears were still lying on the garden wall where he had left them. Edmund had spent 30 years in the company of things that were exactly what they appeared to be. The expression on his face told me before he said anything more that whatever he had just found under my car was not that. I handed Edmund my phone without a word. He understood immediately, the way people who have worked alongside you for decades understand things without requiring explanation, and he lowered himself back down to the concrete floor with the same careful deliberateness as before, this time with the phone held in front of him. The flash activated with each photograph, small, sharp bursts of white light in the dimness under the car, each one followed by a click that seemed in the absolute silence of that garage far louder than a phone camera had any right to be. I stood with my hands in my jacket pockets and listened to those clicks and thought about the morning I had been having. Edmund slid out after the fourth photograph, stood up, and handed the phone back to me. I looked at the screen. The images were clear. The flash had done its job well, illuminating the undercarriage with a clinical precision that left nothing ambiguous. I could see the gray block, roughly the size and shape of a thick paperback novel, secured to the chassis with metal strapping. I could see the small black housing mounted beside it, trailing 2 wires, one to a connector that disappeared toward the engine compartment, one back into the block itself. I had never seen anything like it in person. I had read enough over the years, in the kind of background security briefings that executives of certain wealth and visibility occasionally received to understand what I was looking at. "Tell me exactly what I'm seeing," I said. Edmund pulled his work jacket tighter across his chest, the way a man does when he is settling in to say something he wants to say precisely. He spoke in the unhurried, methodical tone of someone whose professional life had been built on the accurate description of mechanical systems. "The gray block is C4, he said. "Plastic explosive. The compound itself is extremely stable. It won't detonate from heat or impact alone. You could hit it with a hammer and nothing would happen. But it's not alone." He pointed at the small black housing in the photograph on my screen. "That's a thermal switch. It's wired into the engine cooling system, specifically into the coolant temperature sensor circuit. When the engine runs and the coolant reaches normal operating temperature, approximately 90 degrees Celsius, which happens somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes of driving the switch, closes the circuit. When that circuit closes, current flows from an auxiliary battery pack mounted here." He indicated another component in the photograph, through an electric detonator that's embedded directly into the C4. The detonator fires. "The C4 detonates." He paused and looked at me steadily. "Whoever built this knew automotive systems, Mr. Ashford. They knew exactly which circuit to tap into so that no warning light would appear on the dashboard. The car would have driven and handled completely normally. You would have had no indication that anything was wrong." He paused again. This was not put together by amateurs. I looked at the photographs again. My thumb moved to the next image without my quite deciding to move it. The angle was slightly different. Edmund had shifted the light to capture the wiring more clearly. The detail was extraordinary. Whoever had done this had taken care with it, the way a craftsman takes care, which is somehow worse than carelessness. 15 minutes from Ashford Manor to the Fairmont Hotel on Nob Hill. I had made that drive dozens of times through the slope of California Street, past the cable car line, into the mid-morning traffic of the city center. 15 minutes of ordinary driving, and then the coolant would have reached 90 degrees, and the switch would have closed, and the circuit would have completed its simple, lethal logic. Not only me, the driver, anyone within the blast radius on a Tuesday morning in one of the most populated corridors of San Francisco. I put that thought in a specific place in my mind, the place where I store things that I cannot afford to fully feel yet, and I kept going. Ed. I looked up from the phone. No one hears about this. Not Dorian, not Mrs. Daly, not Vivien. I held his gaze. Not anyone for any reason until I tell you otherwise. Edmund looked back at me for a long moment. His expression did not change. "Ma 30 years, Mr. Ashford," he said quietly. "You've never had to ask me that before," and he was right. I hadn't. I nodded once, and he picked up his pruning jacket from the workbench and walked back out toward the garden without another word. The side door closed softly behind him. I stood alone in the garage with my phone in my hand. The silver shadow sat in the overhead light, immaculate and silent, the car that I had allowed into my home and my life, because a man I trusted had told me to. It looked exactly the same as it always had. It would have looked exactly the same on the drive to the Fairmont. There would have been no warning. There would have been nothing to see. I opened my contacts and scrolled until I found the name. I had not called it in a long time, 3 years, perhaps 4, the last time being a dinner in Sausalito that had ended with bourbon and a long silence on the water. The name read simply M. Pierce, Montgomery Pierce, retired FBI, 22 years, with the Bureau's financial crimes and organized crime divisions currently working private investigations from an office on Battery Street in the financial district. 68 years old, and still the most dangerous man I had ever shaken hands with, which he would be the last to advertise and the first to confirm if you asked him directly. I stood there with my thumb above the call button, and I let myself remember just for a moment a winter night in Manhattan in 1987, a hotel corridor, a man I had never met before, a situation that had moved from bad to very bad in the space of about 90 seconds, and the particular sound that a specific kind of trouble makes when it turns a corner and walks straight at you. Monty Pierce had been the one walking toward it from the other direction. There were 2 words that I had not spoken to another living person in 15 years. A code of sorts, the kind that forms not by design, but by circumstance, the shorthand that 2 people develop when they have shared something that has no adequate language. He would know them the moment he heard them. And when he heard them, he would know that what I was calling about was not something that could be handled through ordinary channels. I pressed call. It rang twice. On Neil. His voice came through exactly as I remembered it. Unhurried, gravel-edged, the voice of a man who had spent decades listening more carefully than most people speak. I said the 2 words. The line was quiet for 3 full seconds. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Monty said. And the call ended. I took the back stairs up to my study, not because I needed to avoid anyone. Vivien had left for her studio by 9. Sebastian had a client meeting downtown that would keep him occupied until early afternoon. Theo was with Mrs. Daly in the kitchen. The house was as close to empty as a house with 4 people in it ever gets. I took the back stairs because I needed 30 seconds of moving through a quiet space before I sat down, and the back staircase narrow and uncarpeted. with its view of the garden through the small window on the landing, had always given me that. I went into the study, closed the door, and stood at the glass wall that looked out over the garden. Edmund was back at the roses. He had not missed a beat, the shears moving through the branches with the same steady rhythm as before, as if nothing had changed in the last 40 minutes. He had always been that way. Margaret had noticed it before I did. Ed has the gift of continuity, she had said once. He understands that the work still needs doing, regardless of what else is happening. I had thought she meant gardening. I was beginning to understand she had meant something larger. I stood at the window for perhaps 2 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and scrolled to the name. The call connected on the second ring. I said 2 words. The same 2 words I had not spoken to another living person in 15 years. The year and the city where Montgomery Pierce and I had first understood what we were to each other. The line was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, North Beach Cafe. 1 hour, come alone. The call ended. No questions. That was the agreement, and it always had been. I was 26 when I started Ashford Gemstone. By 33, I had grown it from a single storefront on West 47th Street to a company with 3 locations and a reputation that had just earned its first significant international contract. The trip to Manhattan in December of 1987 was to sign the paperwork, a diamond supply agreement, with a Belgian consortium that would define the company's next decade. I remember walking back from the meeting to my hotel, taking the longer route through the side streets because the evening was cold and clear, and I was 33 and had just done something I had not been entirely certain I was capable of doing. The 2 men came out of a doorway on a block I should not have been on. It was over very quickly, and then a man I had never seen before came out of the darkness from the other direction. He was younger than me, lean, wearing a jacket that had no business being warm enough for December. He moved with the kind of economy that has nothing performative in it, every action going exactly where it needed to go, and no further. In less than 30 seconds, both men were on the ground, and the stranger was standing in the lamplight, looking at me with an expression that said he was assessing whether I was injured, in that order before anything else. His name was Montgomery Pierce. He was 31 years old and 3 years into a career with the FBI's Organized Crime Division, and he had been conducting surveillance on a fence operation 2 blocks away when he saw where the evening was heading. He told me this over coffee in a diner on 5th Avenue 40 minutes later, drinking it black, speaking in the clipped and unhurried way of someone for whom unnecessary words are a professional hazard. We sat in that diner for 2 hours. We have been talking in one form or another ever since. The phrase came later, not designed, just arrived at the way certain understandings between people accumulate into shorthand. If I said those 2 words, it meant real danger, immediate meeting, no questions, until we are face to face. He had used it once in 2003 when a credible threat against a client of his had turned out to have implications he needed to verify against my knowledge of a particular network. I had used it once before today in 2009 when a situation involving a business rival had moved into territory that I could not navigate alone. He had never been wrong about when it was necessary. Neither had I. North Beach in the mid-morning has a particular quality. The breakfast crowd gone, the lunch crowd not yet arrived, the neighborhood in the brief window when it belongs mostly to itself. The cafe Monty had chosen was on a side street off Columbus Avenue, the kind of place with 4 small tables and an espresso machine that sounded like it had opinions. I arrived at 11:25. He was already there. He was seated at the corner table with his back to the wall and his sight line to the door, the way he had been sitting in every public space I had ever met him in. 68 years old, gray at the temples, and throughout wearing a dark jacket over a collarless shirt. He looked like a man who had retired from something demanding and was comfortable with what that had cost him. He did not greet me when I sat down. He looked at me and waited. I placed my phone on the table and opened the photographs Edmund had taken. I did not say anything. I turned the screen toward him. He looked at each image in sequence, taking his time using 2 fingers to enlarge the details around the thermal switch housing and the wiring connection. His expression did not change. When he had seen all 4 photographs, he set the phone on the table between us and looked up. "Tell me," he said. So I told him, from the moment Theo had come through the study door that morning, the whisper, the words in French, the name to Edmund on the garage floor, to the photographs, to the 40-minute walk through the back lanes of Pacific Heights that I had taken instead of a drive to the Fairmont Hotel. I told it in sequence, and I did not editorialize because Monty had once told me in a different context that the most useful thing a witness can do is report and leave the interpretation to someone whose job that is. He listened without interrupting. He made 3 brief notes on a small paper he produced from his jacket pocket, writing in the compressed shorthand of someone who has spent decades reducing complex situations to their essential components. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Whoever built that switch knew automotive systems at a professional level," he said. "The thermal trigger through the coolant circuit, that's not improvised knowledge. Somebody with real technical background or somebody trained by someone with it." He paused. "This is organized, Neil. This has been planned. This is not opportunistic." I nodded. I already knew that. I had known it since Edmund's face in the garage. Monty looked at me steadily across the small table. "You already know who ordered this," he said. "You've known since this morning. You just haven't said the name out loud yet." The cafe was quiet around us. The espresso machine hissed once and went still. Outside, a cable car bell rang somewhere on Columbus, faint and ordinary, belonging to a city that had no idea what was sitting in this corner table. He was right. I had known since the moment Theo had said Mr. Mercer in his careful, frightened French. I had known through every subsequent hour, through the breakfast table performance, through the garage, through the walk, through the back lanes. I had been carrying the name like a stone behind my sternum since 7:20 in the morning. Saying it out loud in this quiet cafe meant accepting that the man who had eaten at my table this morning, who had wished me luck tonight with a smile that I now understood, had nothing behind it, had spent time and money and deliberate effort arranging for me not to come home. I picked up my coffee cup, set it down, and I said the name. Monty produced the paper and pen from his jacket pocket, the way he produced everything without ceremony, as though the object had simply been waiting for its moment, and he was merely providing the introduction. He set them on the table between us and looked at me. "Write down everything you know about him," he said. From the first day Vivien brought him home, I looked at the blank page for a moment. There is something about a blank page that resists the beginning of certain kinds of accounting, the kind where what you are writing is not information, but admission. I picked up the pen. The first thing I wrote was the name, Sebastian Mercer. In my own handwriting on a piece of paper in a cafe on a side street in North Beach at noon on a Tuesday. It looked strange. 7 years of familiarity stripped away in the time it took to form 8 letters, and what remained was the shape of a stranger. I wrote what I knew. He had appeared in Vivien's life in the spring of 2017, at a jewelry and design exposition in New York, the kind of event that occupies 3 floors of a midtown hotel for 4 days, and draws everyone from auction house representatives to independent designers looking for collectors. Vivien had gone for the professional contacts. She had come back with Sebastian. He had introduced himself as a financial and mergers attorney. His practice focused on M&A work in real estate and emerging technology, his office in San Francisco's financial district. Harvard Law, a list of transactions names I recognized. Figures that were credible, a professional history that had the texture and density of something real. He had been from the first evening I met him exactly right. The handshake that was firm without performance. The eye contact that was direct without aggression. The way he deferred to me in conversation, without appearing to defer the particular skill of a man who understands that the most effective way to flatter an older person is to listen to them as though they might actually know something useful. I had noticed all of it. I had attributed it to confidence and good upbringing. I had noted in the back of my mind that it was perhaps slightly too well calibrated a sense no larger than a grain of sand, that the performance was 1 degree too precise to be entirely unstudied. But I had set it aside. I was in my mid-60s and newly widowed, and I had told myself that a man who has lost his partner is inclined to find fault with anyone who might take her place in his daughter's life. I had told myself I was being old and suspicious. I wrote that down too. Monty read what I had written without picking up the page. His eyes moved across it efficiently, the way they moved across the photographs earlier, gathering, not reacting. Then he asked the question. Has he ever had access to the Ashford family trust? I set the pen down. The question was precise enough that I understood he had already formed a hypothesis. Monty did not ask questions he had no reason to ask. I thought about how to say what I needed to say next, and then I decided that the only productive way to say it was directly. 2 years ago, he proposed a restructuring of the investment accounts. Reallocation across asset classes, some adjustments to the trust's discretionary layer. He framed it as optimization, said the current structure was underperforming against benchmarks for comparable family office portfolios. I paused. I had my accountant review his proposal. It was detailed and technically sound. I gave him limited discretionary authority over one investment sub-account. How limited? $12 million. He could move funds between pre-approved categories without requiring my signature on each transaction. Monty wrote something on the paper. A single line. He did not look up when he wrote it. "Give me 48 hours, he said. The auction at the Fairmont that evening went the way these things go when they have been carefully organized, and the right people have been invited smoothly, with the particular energy of a room full of wealthy individuals who are engaged in competitive generosity for a cause that reflects well on all of them. The Blue Ashford suite sold at $47 million, $2 million above the estimate, to a collector whose representative bid by phone from London." The room applauded. Chairwoman Patterson shook my hand and said something gracious. I smiled and said something appropriate in return. I remember almost none of it. What I remember is coming home. The dinner table at Ashford Manor that evening had the relaxed quality that follows a successful public event, the small unwinding that happens when a large thing has concluded well, and the people around the table have permission to simply exist for an hour without agenda. Vivien poured the wine. Theo was in bed. Sebastian sat across from me and cut his steak with the silver-handled knife that Margaret had bought at a flea market in Paris in 1994. A knife that had been on this table for 30 years, and he told a story about a client meeting that had gone sideways in a way that was apparently quite funny. Vivien laughed. She had a particular laugh, quick, unguarded, the laugh of someone who has not yet learned to be careful with happiness. I had always loved that laugh. I watched Sebastian make her laugh, and I held my wine glass, and I kept my face in the arrangement it needed to be in. He lifted his glass toward me near the end of the meal. "To the auction," he said. $47 million for a good cause. You've built something extraordinary, Neil." Margaret would have been proud. Margaret's name in his mouth. I let the thought arrive and let it pass. I raised my glass. I held his gaze. I said what you say when someone proposes a toast, which is nothing of any substance whatsoever, and we drank. He smiled. It was a good smile, warm, easy, completely inhabited. If I had not spent the morning in a garage looking at photographs of a thermal detonator fitted to the undercarriage of my car, I would have thought it was real. After dinner, he excused himself to his study to review documents for an early meeting. Vivien helped Mrs. Daly clear the table. I sat for a few minutes in the empty dining room with the last half-inch of wine in my glass and the candlelight moving on the walls, and tried to locate some version of the evening that was not what It was. I could not find one. I went to bed at 11. I lay awake until 2. At 2 in the morning, with the house quiet around me, and the October fog moving against the windows, the way San Francisco fog does slowly, without urgency, as though it has nowhere it particularly needs to be. I thought about the $12 million, about what Monty might find when he looked at where it had gone, about the 48 hours between now and knowing, and I thought about something else, something I had noticed at various points over 7 years, and each time filed away without examining it. Sebastian Mercer had never in any conversation I had been part of mentioned his family. Not a parent, not a sibling, not a hometown offered in passing, not a childhood story told over dinner, not a holiday that had belonged to someone before him. He had appeared in 2017 with a complete and detailed professional history, and almost no personal history at all. I had thought on the occasions when I noticed it that he was simply a private man. Lying in the dark at 2 in the morning, I was no longer thinking that. The morning of the 16th, I came downstairs at my usual time, poured my coffee from the pot Mrs. Daly had left on the warmer, and sat down at the breakfast table across from the man who had fitted a thermal detonator to the undercarriage of my car. There is a skill that 30 years in business teaches you, the skill of sitting in a room with someone who wants to destroy you and smiling as though you have no idea. I had used versions of it across negotiating tables in boardrooms, in the particular theater of high-stakes transactions, where the numbers are large and the civility is a performance, and everyone present understands this and performs anyway. I had thought of it as a professional competency, the way fluency in financial modeling or the ability to read a room is a professional competency. A tool. I had not until that week expected to need it at my own breakfast table. Sebastian was reading. Vivien was on her second cup of coffee looking at something on her tablet. The morning had its ordinary architecture, the smell of bread, the low sound of the radio in the kitchen, the particular quality of Pacific Heights light coming through the east windows. Everything in its right place. Edmund had begun the protocol before 6 that morning. I had worked out the parameters with him the previous evening, in 3 minutes of conversation, in the back garden, speaking quietly under the sound of the wind in the camellia trees. 3 minutes of engine running at 6 a.m., enough to be audible from the side of the house, if anyone was listening enough, to produce the small exhaust signature that a car being warmed up produces. Then the silver shadow moved into the front drive in the afternoon and back into the garage in the early evening. A car being maintained, a car in the normal rotation of a household. Nothing worth looking at twice. Edmund had the mechanical precision for it. He knew exactly where the temperature threshold sat. He had specified it himself. Standing in that garage with the photographs still on my phone, and 3 minutes of idling on a cool October morning would not come within 20 degrees of it. The car would remain inert. Sebastian would see what he expected to see. Still having the car serviced, Sebastian asked at breakfast, his eyes moving up briefly from his phone. Ed is thorough, I said. Good things take the time they take. He nodded and looked back at his screen. I cut my toast and ate it, and watched the garden through the window where Edmund was visible at the far wall, moving among the roses with his usual unhurried precision. And I thought, 3 decades, and this is what it comes to. The third evening I was at the dinner table helping myself to the salad, when I felt something pressed into my palm from the left side. Small folded once. I closed my hand around it without looking. Theo was sitting beside me eating his chicken, with the focused attention of a child who is pretending very hard to be interested only in his plate. I kept my hand under the table and unfolded the paper by feel. I waited until the conversation shifted. Sebastian was telling Vivien something about a colleague, and her attention went with it, and I looked down. The handwriting was the careful, effortful print of a 6-year-old who has been practicing his letters. The French was simple 4 words correctly spelled in the way that a child spells things they have been taught, rather than words they have merely heard. "Are you okay, grandfather?" I folded the paper again, with one hand slid it into my jacket pocket, and reached over and pressed his hand briefly under the table. He did not look up. He picked up his fork and continued eating his chicken. Across the table, Sebastian refilled Vivien's glass and said something that made her laugh. I looked at my plate, and I thought about what it costs a 6-year-old to carry a secret for 3 days and still show up at the dinner table and behave as though everything is ordinary. I thought it was more than it should cost anyone of any age, let alone a child who liked robots and silver grass and French lessons on Sacramento Street. On the morning of the 18th, my phone showed a message from Edmund. It had come in at 7:42, while I was still upstairs. "Can we talk?" "Garden, now." I came down, poured my coffee, and walked out the back door with the cup in my hand. The gesture was ordinary. I walked in the back garden most mornings, and anyone watching from inside would see nothing different. Edmund was at the north wall, not pruning, standing with his work jacket on and his hands at his sides. I stopped beside him and looked at the wall, the way two people look at a shared view when they are having a conversation they do not want to be seen having. "Yesterday afternoon," Edmund said, his voice low and even. "He came to the garage, said he wanted to check on the maintenance timeline. We talked about the car for a few minutes, standard questions, nothing unusual." A pause. Then he told me he knew I was a reasonable man, said he had a proposition. Edmund did not need to tell me what kind. I waited. $2 million, he said. For not paying attention to whatever happened in the garage, and for keeping him informed of your schedule, where you were going, when you were leaving, when you'd be alone in the car. The stone rim of the garden well was 2 feet to my right. I set my coffee cup on it. I did not feel surprise exactly. Surprise requires the unexpected, and by the 18th of October, I had largely reorganized my understanding of what was possible in my own household. What I felt was something colder and more precise, the particular quality of attention that arrives when a situation has resolved from complicated to clear. $2 million. He had gone to Edmund, the man who had worked for this family for 30 years, who had rebuilt the car with his own hands, who knew every system under that chassis. Sebastian had looked at Edmund Groves and seen a variable that could be purchased. That told me something about the state of the plan. A man who makes that move is not operating from a position of confidence. He is operating from a position of pressure, a deadline, a creditor, a timetable that is no longer accommodating. A desperate man makes mistakes, and a desperate man who believed he had just bought the loyalty of my most trusted ally had handed me something I had not expected to have this early, the knowledge of exactly how much trouble he was in, and the certainty that Edmund was now officially and irrevocably on the inside of what I was building against him. I picked up my coffee cup, finished what was in it, walked back toward the house at the same pace I had walked out, unhurried. A man finishing his morning constitutional, nothing remarkable about the Tuesday. Inside, I set the cup in the sink, took out my phone and typed 4 words to Monty. He approached Ed. Tonight. I sat down on the stone bench near the garden well. Not because I was tired. I had learned over 30 years of sitting across from people in difficult rooms that there are moments when the most important thing is to put something solid between yourself and the person you are, with not distance, not silence, but the particular neutrality of a body that has chosen to be still. Edmund was standing 3 feet away, watching me with the patient attention of someone who has said what he needed to say and is now prepared to wait as long as necessary for the response. I needed a few seconds during which my face was not required to do anything. The back garden of Ashford Manor in late October has a particular quality at this hour. The light coming in low and reddish from the west, catching the climbing roses along the north wall, so that the last of the season's blooms seem almost lit from within the leaves on the camellias gone copper at the edges. The air was cold and clean, the way Pacific Heights air gets in the late afternoon when the fog is still hours away and the day has used up all its warmth, but not yet conceded the point. Somewhere in the neighbor's garden, a bird was making a sound it would stop making in another 2 weeks, when the season finally finished arriving. $2 million. Sebastian had looked at Edmund Grove's 30 years of service, 3 decades of early mornings and careful work, and a loyalty that had never once been tested, because it had never once needed to be, and seen something he could buy. That told me everything about the state of his thinking. "Tell me again," I said. "Every word." The order he said them in. Edmund told me again, standing in the fading light with his hands at his sides, recounting the conversation with the same flat precision he had used the first time. Sebastian had come to the garage in the late afternoon with the car maintenance question as an opening. The transition to the proposition had taken less than 3 minutes, which told me it had been prepared, not improvised. The amount stated directly. The requirements, specific access to my daily schedule notification when I would be in the car, and for how long confirmation when the car had been cleared for use. A timetable. Sebastian was working to a timetable. I took out my phone and called Monty. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. I gave him the specifics in the same order Edmund had given them to me. When I finished, there was a brief silence, the silence of a man reorganizing information rather than registering surprise. "This is the opening we needed," Monty said. "He's exposed himself. He made a direct approach with a specific dollar amount and specific requirements. That's a chain of evidence if we handle it correctly from here." A pause. "Ed needs to call him back. Tonight. He'll accept the offer. He'll ask for half the money up front cash. That request alone tells us whether Sebastian has the liquid resources or whether he's being backed. And the information Ed provides, we write it. Every detail of your schedule that Edmund passes to Sebastian will be what we decide it is. We control what Sebastian thinks he knows from this point forward." I looked across the garden at Edmund, who was watching the phone in my hand with the same still patience. I held the phone away from my face. "Are you willing to do this?" I asked him. "It means playing a role with a man who is dangerous and who will be watching you for any inconsistency. It means this goes on for however long it needs to go on." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I did not expect, delivered in the unhurried tone of a man who has thought it through and arrived somewhere settled. "Mrs. Ashford hired me in 1994, he said. "She told me I had honest hands, Mr. Ashford. She said it the day she offered me the job, and I've thought about it many times since then." He paused. "So I think she'd understand if I used those hands to catch a dishonest man." I held the phone in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up at the house at the study window on the upper floor where the light was on, and the reflection of the garden was visible in the glass, and where somewhere inside, a man who had sat at my breakfast table for 7 years was waiting to find out whether he had bought himself a way out. She would, I said. We worked in the study that evening, the 3 of us, Edmund in the chair across from my desk. Monty's voice through the phone's speaker kept low. The room lit only by the desk lamp, because I had not wanted the overhead light visible through the study window. We went through it methodically. The script for the callback, the structure of the false information Edmund would provide, the sequence of steps designed to give Sebastian confidence, without giving him anything that could cause actual harm. Monty handled the operational logic. I handled the details that required knowledge of the household and its rhythms. Edmund listened to both and asked 3 precise questions, all of which improved what we had. At 9:47, Edmund took his phone, dialed the number Sebastian had given him, and waited. It rang 4 times. "Mr. Mercer," Edmund said when the line connected. His voice was entirely ordinary. The slightly formal register he used with people outside the family, unhurried, carrying none of the weight of the previous 48 hours. "I've been thinking about your proposal. I've made my decision." A pause calibrated. "I'll do it. But I want half the money before I give you anything." Cash. I watched his face while he spoke. There was nothing in it. No tension in the jaw, no tightening around the eyes, no tell of any kind. 30 years of working quietly in other people's spaces had given Edmund Groves a particular kind of stillness that most trained negotiators would have envied. The line was quiet for 2 seconds. Then Sebastian's voice composed, careful, the voice of a man who has just received news he was hoping for, but did not want to show he was hoping for, said, "Agreed." Edmund held the phone for another 30 seconds, confirming logistics in the same measured tone, and then ended the call. He set the phone on the edge of my desk and looked at me. "He agreed," Edmund said. The room was quiet. Outside, the fog had arrived at last, moving against the study windows in the way it does, slow, deliberate, as though it owns the place. After Edmund left, I sat alone. The desk lamp cast its narrow pool of light across the walnut surface. I reached into the top right drawer and took out the blue velvet box. I did not open it out of habit this time. I did not open it because the morning required it, or because the day had been long and the stones were a comfort. I opened it because I needed to remember in a way that my mind alone was not sufficient to hold exactly what I was doing and why. 3 stones. 3 mornings that belonged to Margaret and to no one else. I was still looking at them when my phone lit up with a message from Monty sent while Edmund had been on the call. "Check Theo's iPad tonight. The robot footage. You need to see it." I sat for a long time in the study after Edmund left, not moving, not reading the phone, face up on the desk, with Monty's message on the screen. "Check Theo's iPad tonight. The robot footage. You need to see it." The house was entirely quiet around me. Vivien's light had gone off before 10. Sebastian had been in his study until nearly midnight. I had heard him moving once, the sound of his door, the brief run of water in the hall bathroom, and then silence. Daly's rooms were at the far end of the ground floor. The whole of Ashford Manor had arrived at that particular stillness that large houses achieve in the deep hours when every sound the structure makes seems to be the house talking to itself. I read the message again. Then I stood up, turned off the desk lamp, and walked down the hall in the dark. Theo's room was at the end of the corridor past the linen closet and the small window that looked out over the side garden. I opened his door as slowly as the hinges allowed. The room held the particular smell of a child's sleep, something warm and slightly sweet, unaccountable, the smell that has no equivalent in any other context. A nightlight near the baseboard threw a low orange glow across the floor. Agent 7 sat on the bookshelf where it always sat, when not on active mission, its small camera housing facing the room. Theo was asleep on his side, one arm around a stuffed bear that had lost one eye to some previous adventure. His face in the nightlight was completely unguarded. No trace of the effort the last 4 days had cost him, no residue of the careful performance he had maintained at every meal. Just a 6-year-old sleeping, which is one of the few states of pure, uncomplicated existence available to any of us. The iPad was on the study desk beside his bed, charging. I unplugged it, carefully picked it up, and took it back to the hallway. 6 months earlier, in April, a rainstorm had come in from the Pacific, hard enough to keep everyone inside for the better part of a Tuesday afternoon. I had been at my desk trying to work through a set of quarterly projections that deserved more attention than I was giving them, because Theo had appeared in the study doorway at 2 o'clock, with Agent 7 under one arm and a question. He had found a small infrared camera module in the electronics bin I kept on the bottom shelf, the kind of component that ends up in that bin because it was ordered for one purpose and then set aside when the purpose changed. He wanted to know if it could be mounted to Agent 7's front housing, just below the sensor array, without affecting the robot's steering. I looked at the projections. I looked at Theo. I closed the projections. We spent an hour and 40 minutes on the floor of the study, working out the mounting solution with a small screwdriver and 2-sided adhesive tape, testing the camera's output through the app on Theo's iPad, adjusting the angle until the field of view was satisfactory. The camera had a motion detection recording feature that activated automatically in low light, a setting Theo found particularly relevant to covert operations, and which I had left enabled because there seemed no reason not to. "Do you think Agent 7 could catch real bad guys someday, grandfather?" I had laughed. The kind of laugh that comes up without asking permission, genuine and full, because the question was the most earnest thing I had heard in months, and because I had not expected it. I had told him that Agent 7 was already the most accomplished field operative in the Pacific Heights district, and that his career in law enforcement was off to an excellent start. Maybe someday, little one. Standing in the corridor at 2 a.m. with Theo's iPad in my hands, I thought about that afternoon and what I had said, and I could not locate the laugh anywhere. I took the iPad to the study, sat at the desk without turning on the overhead light, and opened the app. The main screen showed the camera feed, currently the interior of Theo's room, the nightlight glow, the edge of the bookshelf. I navigated to the archive. The app had logged automatically by date, the way security apps do, creating a folder for each day the motion detection feature had triggered. I scrolled back to the 15th of October. The file opened onto a grayscale image rendered in the pale green cast of infrared, the inside of the garage seen from the floor-level perspective of a robot parked near the east wall, where Theo must have left Agent 7 after whatever mission had concluded the previous afternoon. The garage in darkness, every detail resolved in the flat, shadowless clarity that infrared produces, making the familiar space look slightly wrong. A photograph of a room that resembles the room you know without quite being it. The timestamp in the lower right corner read 2:17 a.m. The garage door opened from the inside. Dorian Laval came in first. He was wearing dark clothing, not his usual household attire, something without structure, designed not to be seen. He turned back toward the door and made a brief gesture, 2 fingers beckoning, and then moved to the near wall, positioning himself with a clear line to the door. A second person entered, male approximate height, and build visible in the image, wearing a cap pulled low. The bill obscuring the upper face, the lower face partially turned. He carried a bag, the kind with multiple external pockets, the sort that holds tools. He moved directly toward the Rolls-Royce without pausing, without looking around the garage, with the specific purposefulness of someone who already knew exactly where they were going and what they were going to do when they got there. He went down onto his back under the car. Dorian remained standing at the east wall, his position giving him the sight line to the door while the second man worked. He checked the door twice in the first 5 minutes. Then he settled into a stillness that was different from Edmund's stillness. Not the patience of someone accustomed to waiting, but the controlled tension of someone standing guard. The timestamp continued, 42 minutes. The second man slid out from under the car at 2:59 a.m. He stood, checked something on the underside of the bag, an inventory habit, a final confirmation. He nodded once to Dorian. Dorian moved to the door, checked through the gap, then opened it wider and went out first. The second man followed. The door settled closed behind them. The footage continued for another 40 seconds, recording the empty garage, and then the motion detection found nothing further to capture, and the file ended. I sat with the iPad in my hands. I watched it again from the beginning. This time I paused it on the clearest frame of Dorian's face the moment he turned back toward the door after entering, his face fully visible to the infrared camera that a 6-year-old had pointed toward the garage door because he thought it was a good position for surveillance. The image was sharp enough. The timestamp was unambiguous. The location was undeniable. I paused it on the second man. Cap, low face angled down during most of the footage. One frame, the moment he stood up from under the car, showed the lower third of his face with relative clarity, enough to work with. At 2:47 a.m., I forwarded the complete file to Monty with a single line, October 15th. 2:17 a.m. garage. Then I walked back down the corridor to Theo's room, set the iPad on the charging cable, and stood in the doorway for a moment. The stuffed bear was still under his arm, His breathing was slow and even. I thought about what he had asked me on that rainy afternoon in April. Whether Agent 7 could catch real bad guys someday. I had laughed at the seriousness of the question, at the earnest precision of the way he asked it. And I had told him maybe someday, without stopping to wonder whether the question deserved a more careful answer. I owed him an apology for underestimating him. I went back to the study and sat in the dark and waited. At 2:53 a.m., my phone lit up. Monty. 3 words, I know him. And then, after a pause long enough that I had already started to form my response, a second message arrived. Neil, we need to talk about more than just the man who built the bomb. The fog had not fully lifted by 7:30, which is not unusual for October in North Beach. The neighborhood wakes slowly at that hour. The espresso machines in the cafes along Columbus, starting up the delivery trucks making their rounds. The particular early morning quality of a San Francisco block that has been doing the same things in the same order for decades and sees no reason to change. I had arrived at the cafe at 7:15 and taken the same corner table where Monty and I had sat 4 days earlier, and I had been watching the street through the small window ever since, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands. I had not slept. After Monty's second message had come through at nearly 3 in the morning, I had gone back to the study and sat there until the sky outside the garden window began to pale. And then I had changed my jacket, told Mrs. Daly I had an early meeting, and walked the 12 blocks to North Beach in the October cold, because I needed the air and the time. Monty arrived at 7:45 precisely. He moved through the cafe the way he always moved through enclosed spaces, a single visual sweep of the room as he entered, quick and practiced. The assessment of someone for whom old habits are indistinguishable from instinct. He sat down without greeting, which was not rudeness but efficiency, and placed a thin manila folder on the table between us. He looked at me with the particular steadiness he reserved for delivering information that required the recipient to remain calm. "The man in the footage," he said. "I have a name." He opened the folder. The photograph on top was a still frame enhanced, pulled from a street-level security camera mounted on a building 2 blocks from Ashford Manor, cross-referenced against the infrared footage timestamp. The image showed a man in a dark jacket and low-build cap, the same build. In this image, captured under a streetlight, at an angle that the garage camera had not provided, the face was visible. 40s, square jaw. A particular set to the eyes, slightly deep set with a heaviness to the brow that carried a quality I registered before I could articulate why it registered. René Fontaine, Monty said. 44 years old. Born in Quebec City. He crossed into the United States illegally through the Vermont border crossing in 2019, used a rural gap that was under-monitored at the time. No fixed employment since entering the country. He's been working off-book in the construction and contractor sector, primarily in the Bay Area. He turned to the next page. In 2021, he entered a real estate investment arrangement that failed. He lost everything he had put in, and the arrangement left him owing money to the party who had brokered the deal. How much? $380,000. The broker was Sebastian Mercer. I looked at the photograph, the face, the jaw, the eyes. "So Monty," I said, "look at this photograph, and then tell me about Dorian Laval." He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the photograph again, not quickly, but with the focused attention of someone running a comparison. He reached into the folder and produced a second image. A still from the Ashford Manor security system Dorian captured at the front entrance in the ordinary course of a morning, face fully visible. Good resolution. He placed the 2 photographs side by side. The cafe was quiet around us. A machine behind the counter produced a brief, pressurized hiss and went still. "She's same jaw structure," Monty said after a moment. "Same orbital depth. Same brow line." He looked up. "Where did you get this?" I told him about Edmund, about an afternoon, He could not remember exactly when, some months back, when he had come around the corner of the garage and found Dorian standing near the workbench, looking at something in his wallet. A small photograph, the kind that people carry less and less now. A younger man, somewhat resembling Dorian. Dorian had put it away immediately and said something ordinary about the weather, and Edmund had thought nothing more of it, because there was nothing in the moment that invited further thought. He had mentioned it to me in passing weeks later, as one of those small, unremarkable observations that accumulate in the memory of someone who spends 30 years paying quiet attention to a household. We had both noted it and set it aside. Monty made 2 phone calls. He stepped outside for the second one, and I watched him through the window, standing on the sidewalk in the thin October sun, speaking in the compact and efficient way he spoke on calls that mattered, making 2 notes on the small paper he always had in his jacket pocket. He came back in at 8:17 and sat down. "Same father," he said. Pierre Laval. French national, lived in Quebec for a period in the late 1970s, then returned to France. 2 children by 2 different women who never knew about each other. René grew up in Quebec with his mother. Dorian grew up in Lyon with his mother. They have had minimal contact across their lives, a handful of documented communications, nothing sustained. He paused. But they know. They've known for some years. And Sebastian knew. Sebastian knew. Monty folded his hands on the table. A man who does the kind of background work Sebastian appears to have done before embedding himself in your family would have found that connection. And a man with Sebastian's legal training would understand immediately what it was worth as leverage. He was quiet for a moment. He didn't just hire someone to plant a device, Neil. He found 2 men who shared a secret. They had never made public a secret that, if exposed, would at minimum cost Dorian his position, and at maximum expose René's immigration status, and he used that secret as a chain around both of them. I looked at the 2 photographs lying side by side on the cafe table. Dorian Laval, who had stood at the bottom of my staircase 5 days ago and told me my car was ready whenever I wanted it. René Fontaine, who had spent 42 minutes on his back under my car in the dark. They were in my house at the same time, I said. One of them in the kitchen, one of them under my car. Monty did not respond to that. There was nothing useful to add to it. He reached out and gathered the photographs back into the folder and closed it with the flat, practiced motion of someone who has been closing files on difficult facts for a long time. There's more, he said. My contact in the Financial Crimes Division finished the account trace last night. He looked at me steadily across the small table. Neil, I need you to prepare yourself for what the number looks like. Monty placed 3 sheets of paper on the table. They were printouts dense with figures, transaction codes, dates, and account routing numbers organized into columns that had the clean, implacable quality of financial documentation that has been assembled by someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and has found it. He smoothed the pages flat with one hand and turned them so they faced me. And I looked at them the way you look at something that confirms what part of you already knew. $12 million. I had given Sebastian Mercer discretionary authority over $12 million in Ashford family trust assets, with the understanding that he would manage those assets within pre-approved investment categories. I had had my accountant review the arrangement. I had considered it reasonable due diligence. I had trusted a man because my daughter loved him, and because he had spent 3 years being exactly the kind of son-in-law that a widowed father with a substantial business tells himself he is. Fortunate to have. I thought about the afternoon he had presented the restructuring proposal, the way he had set his materials out on the study desk, organized, professional. The presentation of someone who had done this many times and was confident in what he was showing. The way he had looked at me directly when he made his case with the specific quality of eye contact that we have all been conditioned to read as honesty. I'll make this money work harder for you, Neil. He had said almost exactly that. I had thought it was the language of a competent professional who wanted to demonstrate his value to his wife's father. I understood now that it was a blueprint being delivered to the person it was intended to deceive. "Walk me through it," I said. Monty turned to the first page. 47 transactions. He said executed across 18 months. The smallest was $11,000. The largest was $412,000, each one individually sized to remain below the threshold that triggers automatic regulatory review, a pattern that is in itself a federal offense under structuring statutes. He moved his finger down the column. Each transfer went to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, registered to a company called Mercer and Associates, LLC. The company has no employees, no operational address, no business activity of any kind. It exists to receive money and move it. Where did it go from there? From the Cayman account, the funds were transferred in 3 tranches to a private lending entity based in Miami, Florida. My contact at the FBI field office has run that entity through current organized crime databases. It has documented associations with a structured crime organization operating out of South Florida, the kind of organization that extends high-interest credit to people in difficult financial situations and enforces repayment through methods that are not available to licensed lenders. The cafe around us was nearly empty now. A man at the counter was reading a newspaper. The espresso machine was silent. Outside the window, Columbus Avenue was doing its ordinary mid-morning business, entirely indifferent to what was being described at the corner table. The $12 million wasn't enough, I said. It was not a question. The arithmetic was already clear. No. Monty turned to the second page. In 2023, Sebastian invested an additional sum borrowed against anticipated returns from the Ashford accounts into a cryptocurrency investment vehicle that collapsed in the spring of that year. The investment was approximately $9 million. It is now worth approximately $400,000. He set the page down. His total current liability to the Miami organization is in the range of $19 to $20 million. I stood up. I did not decide to stand. My body made that decision independently, the way it sometimes does when the mind is processing something that has exceeded the capacity of a seated position to contain. I walked to the window and stood looking out at Columbus Avenue and the thin October sun on the buildings across the street, and the ordinary Tuesday morning movement of people who had no idea. They gave him a deadline, Monty said from behind me. 60 days. The communication my contact retrieved was sent to Sebastian's private email account 6 weeks ago. He has approximately 2 weeks remaining. I kept my eyes on the street. There's something else in the communication, Neil. I heard him pause. In 22 years, working financial crimes and organized crime, Montgomery Pierce had learned the specific grammar of delivering information that requires a listener to be prepared. The pause was that grammar. The organization included names, he said, as a statement of what they considered available leverage in the event of non-payment. Another pause. Vivien's name is in the message, and Theo's. I stood at the window for a long time. My daughter, who had laughed at the dinner table 4 nights ago without any reason to be careful. My grandson, who had carried a grown man's secret for 4 days on 6-year-old shoulders because he had decided his grandfather needed protecting. Both of their names in a document generated by an organization in South Florida that treated human beings as line items in a collections ledger. I turned around and walked back to the table and sat down. When I spoke, my voice was level. Not because I was not angry, I was, in the way that very cold water is not the same thing as the absence of temperature, but because anger at that particular moment was a resource to be allocated rather than expressed. But I want everything documented, I said. Every account, every transaction, every name that appears in any communication connected to this. Every entity, every routing number, every date. I looked at Monty steadily. We are not only going to stop this, we are going to dismantle every piece of it. Monty held my gaze for a moment. Then he opened his laptop. There's one more thing, he said. When I ran the full background check on Sebastian through my contact at the FBI field office, they flagged something. His credentials, the law degree, the bar admission, the professional history. They all hold up on the surface. The kind of surface that takes real resources to construct. He turned the laptop slightly, not yet showing me the screen. But when they ran his fingerprints through the international database, he stopped. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been in rooms like this one many times before, and has learned that the last piece of information is sometimes the piece that reorganizes everything that came before it. His prints matched a notice, Monty said, an Interpol notice, filed in 2015. The cafe was completely quiet around us. Sebastian Mercer, I said. The name felt different in my mouth now, like a label placed on the wrong container, which it was. He had an Interpol flag 9 years before he walked into my house. 9 years before he walked into your house, Monty said. And 7 years before Vivien brought him to your dinner table. The number on that page, $19 million. The debt of a man who had been flagged by international law enforcement nearly a decade ago and had spent the intervening years constructing a life detailed enough to pass every check I had thought to run sat between us on the table like a weight. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then Monty turned the laptop to face me. Before I show you what was on Monty's laptop screen, the thing that reordered everything Neil thought he knew about the man at his breakfast table, leave one word in the comments. One word for what you think is coming. I want to see how close you are. A reminder the story ahead contains fictional elements crafted for narrative and educational purposes. Some details may not reflect any specific event. If this kind of storytelling is not for you, this is a good moment to step away. No judgment at all. His real name was Patrick Callow, born in Belfast, Northern Ireland on the 14th of March, 1986. 6'2". Brown eyes, a scar along the left jawline from an incident that appeared nowhere in any account he had ever given of himself, and an international criminal record that the man sitting across from my dinner table for 7 years had buried under 3 separate identities and 15 years of careful patient construction. Monty turned the laptop to face me and let me read. I read it the way I had been reading difficult documents for 30 years, starting at the top, moving through it completely, not skipping ahead to the conclusion before I had taken in the sequence that led there. The Interpol file was thorough. It had been built from Scottish and British law enforcement records, cross-referenced with immigration data from 4 countries, and flagged for international distribution in 2015 after a Scotland Yard inquiry failed to produce sufficient evidence for prosecution, but produced sufficient concern to warrant the notice. The first identity change had happened in London in 2012. Patrick Callow had become James Whitfield, a complete set of documents, the kind that a network operating out of Dublin had been producing for clients with the means to pay for them. The Harvard law degree was real. It had been earned genuinely through 3 years of study and 2 bar examinations. But it had been earned by James Whitfield, not Patrick Callow. And the distinction between those 2 names was a distinction that no background check in Sebastian Mercer's professional history had ever been positioned to catch. Eleanor Whitmore, Monty said. He said the name quietly, the way you say the name of someone who is no longer in a position to speak for themselves. I looked at the photograph in the file. A woman in her late 50s captured in what appeared to be a garden setting, a social occasion of some kind, a party perhaps, the kind where someone moves through the frame in the background, while the subject is looking toward the camera with the open expression of someone who is not thinking about how they look. Warm face, approachable, The kind of face that trusts people because it has not yet encountered sufficient reason not to. 58 years old, Monty said. Widowed. Significant estate property and Hampstead investment portfolio, no children. James Whitfield was her estate attorney. He paused. She died in a car accident on Hampstead Heath on the evening of November 7, 2014. Scotland Yard opened an inquiry. The inquiry ran for 4 months and found no evidence sufficient to support a criminal charge. Another pause. James Whitfield left London 8 days after her death. The Interpol notice was issued the following year, when her estate solicitor flagged irregularities in the account activity during the final months before her death. I looked at Eleanor Whitmore's face in the photograph, a woman I had never met, a woman who had sat across a dinner table from Patrick Callow and believed the name he gave her and trusted him with her legal affairs, and in all probability with something more than that. A woman who had not come back from a drive on a November night in London. She trusted him, I said. She did, and he chose Vivien the same way he chose her. I was not asking. The file in front of me had already answered the question before I thought to ask it. The same method, the same patience, the same calculation. A wealthy family, Monty said. An accessible entry point, the jewelry exposition, was the kind of event he would have researched in advance. A daughter with independent standing and a father with significant assets. He spent 7 years building the position before he needed to use it. He was quiet for a moment. Patrick Callow is not impulsive, Neil. Everything we are looking at, the financial structuring, the identities, the approach to Dorian and Renee, it is all the work of someone who plans at length and executes with patience. I closed the laptop. I sat with my hands flat on the table and looked at the closed screen and thought about my daughter. I thought about the way she had looked at Sebastian when she first brought him home 7 years ago. The particular quality of happiness in her face, the kind that a parent recognizes as real because you have watched the same face since it was learning to form expressions and you know which ones it borrows and which ones it means. I thought about how she looked at him now, still across the dinner table 4 nights ago, when he had refilled her wine and made her laugh. She had not borrowed that. What I was about to do would break something in her that would take a long time to repair. There was no way to do it that would not do that. There was no version of this conversation that did not end with my daughter understanding that the last 7 years of her life had been a deliberate construction, and that the man she had built them with had a name she had never heard, and that a woman in London had trusted him before she did. The alternative was leaving her beside Patrick Callow. I need to tell Vivien, I said, before anything else moves forward. She needs to know who she's living with. Monty nodded once. That will be the hardest conversation of your life. Yes, I said, it will. I drove home alone. Monty gave me 2 hours. I walked into the house, past the hallway, where Dorian was somewhere in the building, past the dining room, where Patrick Callow had sat with Margaret's silver knife, and into the design studio, where Vivien was bent over a new sketch, her pen moving in the quick. Certain lines she had used since she was a teenager, making drawings on the backs of my meeting agendas. She looked up when I came in. I said 4 words that changed everything between us from that moment forward. I need to show you something. I had prepared what I wanted to say across the full length of the drive home, and the 2 hours that followed the order of the evidence, the words to use for each piece of it. The specific quality of voice I would need to maintain when I got to the parts that were going to be the hardest. I had rehearsed it in the way you rehearse something you know cannot be rehearsed. When Vivien came into the study and sat down across from me with her easy smile. What is it, Dad? Every word I had prepared left me completely. I looked at my daughter. Then I looked at the corner of the desk, where the blue velvet box sat the way it always sat. I thought about Margaret, who had always been better than me at delivering hard truths without removing the love from them. I thought, I wish you were here for this one. Then I placed the folder on the desk, and slid it toward Vivien. She opened it, read the first page, the transaction records, the 47-line items that came in routing numbers. She read it carefully, the way she reads everything. And when she looked up, her expression was the one I had expected and dreaded in equal measure. "Dad, there has to be an explanation. Sebastian structures complex financial arrangements. This could be a legitimate reallocation that neither of us fully understands yet. Have you spoken to him directly?" I didn't answer. I placed the next page on top of the first, the infrared still from Agent 7's footage timestamp, 2:17 a.m. Dorian at the garage door, and a second man bent beneath my car. Hurry, that could be a security check. Sebastian always said Dorian was thorough about Vivien. I kept my voice as quiet as I could make it. "Keep reading." She stood up. Her voice, when it came, was shaking, but with anger, not grief. "Not yet. Do you hear what you're saying? You're accusing my husband of trying to have you killed, based on a night vision video and some wire transfers. Sebastian is a lawyer. He understands financial law better than anyone. There are 100 legitimate explanations for... Vivien, please sit down." "I am not sitting down. This is my marriage, and you're sitting here with your private investigator trying to... Please." I stood up, walked around the desk, opened the folder to the last page and placed it in front of her without saying anything else. She looked down at it. Eleanor Whitmore. The garden photograph. Beneath it, the crash site image, a silver car against a wall on a dark road in Hampstead, taken from a police file, and the text of the Scotland Yard inquiry summary, and the name at the center of it. Patrick Callow, Belfast, Northern Ireland. Vivien sat down slowly, the way a person sits when the legs make the decision independently. For a long moment she didn't speak. She looked at Eleanor Whitmore's face in the garden photograph, the open expression, the unguarded happiness of someone at a party who doesn't know they're being looked at. Her name was Eleanor, Vivien said, not a question. She was reading the name aloud the way you do when making something real. She died in a car accident. Scotland Yard didn't believe it was an accident. Vivien looked at the photograph for a long time. Then at the crash site. Then at her own hands resting open in her lap. The hands she used to draw the curved lines of jewelry that people wore on days that mattered to them. She looked at those hands as though she was seeing them in a different context than the one she had inhabited this morning. He chose me the same way he chose her. Not a question. A statement of fact arrived at, alone said aloud for the first time. I didn't answer. Nothing I could say would be more or less than what she had just said herself. She sat for another moment. Then she stood slowly, with the careful steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is now carrying it in their body. She looked at her left hand. She took hold of the ring and removed it without hesitation, without looking at me, and set it on the walnut desk between us. The sound it made was small. In that quiet room, it was not small at all. Do what you have to do, Dad. She walked out without looking back. I sat for a long time after she left, looking at the ring on the desk. I thought about the engagement evening, the way Sebastian had taken it, from the case I had opened, the way Vivien had looked at it in the light. The stone was a flawless Ashford piece. I had chosen it myself. I had placed it in the wrong hands and not known. I picked up my phone and called Monty. She knows, I said. We're ready. Call your contact at the bureau. Edmund's message came in at 6:47 in the morning, while I was still in the Tesla with the engine running in the driveway, checking that I had everything in the document folder on the passenger seat. Sebastian called again last night, asking when you're taking the rolls out. He's losing patience. I read it twice. Then I set the phone on the console, backed out of the drive, and pointed the car toward the Civic Center. I had been to the Richard H. Chambers building once before, 20 years ago, as a witness in a customs investigation involving conflict diamonds moving through a Bay Area import network. That time I had walked in as a cooperating party with nothing more than information and a willingness to share it. I had been nervous in the particular way that honest people are nervous in law enforcement buildings, which is completely and for no good reason. This time I walked in with a document folder containing evidence of wire fraud, attempted murder by explosive device identity fraud across 3 countries, and the fingerprint match of a man that Interpol had been looking for since 2015. The nervousness felt different, more like weight than anxiety. The weight of everything that had led to this corridor, this elevator, this door. Monty was already in the waiting area on the 4th floor. He stood when he saw me, looked at the folder in my hand, and said nothing. We were shown into a conference room with no windows and a table that seated 8. The fluorescent light was the flat, unsparing kind that government buildings favor. Special Agent Diana Reeves came in 3 minutes later. She was around 50 with silver hair cut short and practical, and the kind of eyes that are always doing something, moving, measuring, filing, even when the rest of the face is still. She wore a dark blazer and no jewelry, and she shook both our hands with the brief, conclusive grip of someone who regards the social rituals of a meeting as necessary, but not the point of it. She sat. We sat. Monty opened. He laid out the 3 legal foundations in sequence the way he had laid out everything across the past week, methodically, without editorializing, letting the structure carry the weight. The first was wire fraud under Federal Statute 47, interstate wire transfers executed across 18 months. Moving funds from a California-based family trust through a Cayman Islands shell company and into a structured criminal lending organization based in Florida. The total, $12 million. The statute, federal jurisdiction by default, given the interstate and international movement of funds. The second was the use of explosive materials in connection with an attempted homicide. A block of C4 plastic explosive fitted with an electric detonator and a thermal trigger, currently still in place beneath the undercarriage of a vehicle garaged at a private residence in Pacific Heights. This brought in not only the Bureau, but the ATF, given federal explosive statutes. The footage from the infrared camera established placement time and the identity of at least one participant. The third was the Interpol flag. Sebastian Mercer's fingerprints on file from a 2019 California bar application matched the record of Patrick Callow, a subject of an Interpol red notice issued in 2015 in connection with a Scotland Yard inquiry into the death of Eleanor Whitmore, London, November 2014. Scotland Yard was being notified through Interpol Washington simultaneously with this meeting. Reeves listened to all of it without interrupting. When Monty finished, she pulled the folder toward her and went through it. The transaction records, the infrared stills, the Interpol documentation, the Patrick Callow file page by page, with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything else. She watched the robot footage on Monty's laptop in full, then watched it again. Then she sat back and looked at me. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "you've brought us a federal case spanning 3 legal jurisdictions. We don't just have authority here." She paused. "We have an obligation." The plan was established in the next 40 minutes. Edmund would send Sebastian one final piece of false information that evening, a message confirming that I intended to drive the Rolls-Royce early the following morning, destination Pebble Beach, a route long enough and private enough to be credible. The Bureau would have the vehicle secured and the explosive safely removed by a specialized ATF unit before 6 a.m. Arrest warrants for Patrick Callow and Dorian Laval would be executed simultaneously. I drove home in the early afternoon. The dinner that evening was the last one. Sebastian sat across from me and ate and talked and demonstrated for the final time the performance that had taken him 7 years to build and that would be over before sunrise. I watched him and felt nothing that resembled what I had felt at previous dinners. No anger, no grief, no residual confusion. Something colder. The clarity that comes when a problem has been fully defined and the solution is already in motion. After dinner, he excused himself. Vivien had not spoken a word to him across the meal, which he appeared to attribute to a marital difficulty he had not yet been able to address. He did not know that there was no marital difficulty. There was only the truth which Vivien now carried, and which had changed the geometry of every room she shared with him. I went to bed at 9. I lay in the dark and listened to the house around me. Vivien's light still on at the end of the hallway. Theo asleep across from her. Sebastian in the guest room, where he had moved himself without explanation 2 days ago, because Vivien had stopped speaking to him, and he did not know why, and could not ask. At 9:43, Edmund sent the message to Sebastian's number. Mr. Ashford is taking the rolls out early tomorrow. Something about Pebble Beach. Leaving around 6. I stared at the ceiling of my own bedroom and listened to the house breathe. Tomorrow everything would either resolve cleanly or come apart entirely. I had done everything I could do. The rest was already in motion, moving the way large things move once they have been set going quietly and with a momentum that does not require my participation to continue. I did not sleep at all. I had been awake for an hour before the alarm. At 5 o'clock, I was already sitting at the walnut desk in the dark, the house silent around me. The Pacific Heights fog pressing against the study windows the way it does in the last hours before dawn, insistent, unhurried, indifferent to whatever the day has planned. I had not slept. My body had stopped pretending sometime around 2 in the morning that sleep was something it intended to do. I opened the top right drawer. I took out the blue velvet box. I had opened it 1,000 times in 4 years, in grief and in habit, and once in the middle of a crisis for the particular kind of courage that only certain things can give you. This time I opened it in the dark of a morning that was either going to go exactly right or come apart in a way I could not fully plan for. I looked at the 3 stones in the narrow light from the desk lamp. The sapphire, the pearl, the amber, Margaret. I had not said her name aloud in the study in a long time. I said it quietly now to the stones and to the room and to whatever remains of a person in the spaces where they once were. Today it ends. I closed the box, placed it back in the drawer, and I picked up my phone. At 5:47, I received confirmation from Special Agent Reeves that the ATF unit had completed its work. The device had been removed from the undercarriage of the Rolls-Royce in the early hours of the morning, safely, completely, with documentation sufficient to support federal prosecution. The Silver Shadow was for the first time in 6 days simply a car. At 6 o'clock, Edmund opened the garage door, started the engine, and let it run for 3 minutes. Then he left the door standing open the way a man leaves a door open when something is about to come out of it. At 6:23, René Fontaine came through the rear gate. He had come the way he had come, the first time through the service lane in the gray of the early morning, moving with the economy of someone who has done a thing before and expects to do it again without incident. He made it as far as the side passage before the agents stepped out of the shadows. 4 of them in plain clothes positioned at the angles that left no direction open. He was on the ground and in restraints in less time than it takes to read a sentence about it. He did not resist. I think he understood in the moment the agents appeared that the thing he had been brought here to do had already been undone. At 6:24, Reeves confirmed this to me afterward with the specific timing, because precision is how she speaks. 2 agents and 2 San Francisco Police Department officers entered the staff quarters on the ground floor's east wing and knocked on Dorian Laval's door. He was still in the room. He opened the door and looked at the 4 people standing in the hallway and did not say a word. He put his hands out. 30 years of observing this household, and his last act in it was one of the most dignified things I have ever seen. At 6:31, the office of Mercer Financial Group on the 22nd floor of a building on California Street in the financial district received visitors it was not expecting. Sebastian Patrick Callow had arrived early the way Reeves told me he had arrived early every morning since the 14th of October. waiting. He was seated at his desk, signing documents when the door opened. He looked up. I was not there. But Reeves described the moment to me later with a specificity I found I needed. The color that left his face. The half-second of absolute stillness. The way the pen stayed in his hand for a moment after it was no longer useful. Sebastian Mercer. This is the FBI. You're under arrest. He did not resist either. Patrick Callow, who had spent 15 years being other people in other cities with other names, had the particular stillness of someone who has always known at some level that a morning like this one was coming. I set my phone on the desk when the final confirmation came in. I looked out through the study window at the garden below, where the October light was just beginning to arrive, pale and thin through the fog, catching the last of the season's red and gold in the camellia trees. The leaves that let go fell without sound. The silence was something I had not felt in 5 days. I let it be. Vivien knocked once and came in. She looked at my face and understood. She crossed to the window and stood beside me, and we looked at the garden together without speaking. The way people who have come through something together sometimes do not need words immediately. "Is it over?" she said after a while. "The main part of it." She was quiet. Then, "Where's Theo?" "School. He doesn't know yet." She nodded slowly. Outside, another leaf let go and fell. "He saved your life, Dad." "He saved all of ours," I said. We stood at the window together for a long time. The fog was beginning to lift, the way San Francisco fog always eventually lifts slowly without announcement, until you look up and realize the sky has been there all along. That afternoon, Reeves called with one final piece. Scotland Yard had been formally notified. The Whitmore inquiry was being reopened with the fingerprint evidence and the full documentation that Monty's contact had compiled. An extradition request had been lodged with the U.S. Department of Justice within hours of the arrest. The man who had called himself Sebastian Mercer, who had sat at my dinner table and called me family, and wished me luck on the evening he believed would be my last, was going to answer for more than what he had done in my garage. He was going to answer for Eleanor Whitmore, who had trusted him on a November night in London 10 years ago and had not come home. I thought about her photograph in the file, the garden party, the open face. You are not forgotten, I thought. Not anymore. In 30 years of business, I have learned that the truth rarely arrives in shouts or tears. It arrives in the quiet moments when a person no longer has the energy to maintain the story they have been telling. Renée Fontaine reached that moment in less than 40 minutes. Reeves told me afterward with the particular precision she brought to everything that he had not broken under pressure. He had simply run out of reasons to hold on. He was not a professional criminal. He was a man who had made a series of increasingly desperate decisions and had ended up in a garage in Pacific Heights at 2 a.m. because someone with leverage over him had told him to be there. When the agent sat down across from him and explained what they already knew, the remaining calculation was straightforward. He told them everything. Sebastian had approached him through Dorian, the shared blood between the two brothers, providing the introduction, and the threat of exposure providing the motivation. The immigration status, the debt, the promise of erasure if Renée did what was needed. Renée had sourced the device through a cross-border network that the FBI's Organized Crime Division was Reeves noted already familiar with. The technical specifications had come from Sebastian, directly detailed, typed, formatted, with the precision of a man who had researched the subject thoroughly before delegating the execution. Dorian held out longer. He denied everything through the first hour of questioning, which Reeves said was more discipline than she had expected from someone in his position. Then she placed the infrared still on the table between them. His face clear and unambiguous in the flat green light, the timestamp in the corner. He looked at the photograph for a long time, Then he told them about the brother he had never spoken of publicly, and the man who had found that silence and used it as a lever. And the morning he had stood at the garage door and watched Renee disappear beneath a car that belonged to a family that had given him 30 years of honest work. The search of Sebastian's office took most of the first day, behind the third drawer of the filing cabinet behind a false panel that a routine search might have missed. But a thorough one would not. The agents found a USB drive. It was encrypted with a level of security that Reeves told me took the Bureau's digital forensics team 47 hours to breach. What was on it had a name. Project Purification, a document running to 11 pages formatted like a legal brief because Patrick Callow had spent 15 years thinking like a lawyer, and old habits do not yield to circumstance. A timeline, a risk assessment, a section on insurance payouts $5 million in life coverage on Neil Ashford, the beneficiary designation structured so that Vivien would inherit, and through her, Sebastian would control. A section on the family trust, and what portion of it would convert to liquid assets upon Neil's death. The total figure, including both insurance and inherited assets, landed close to $40 million. Then the second document. Reeves read portions of it to me over the phone sitting in my study in the early evening while the fog came in from the ocean and the room grew dark around me. I did not turn on the lamp. It was a letter. Written in my voice, or a version of my voice close enough to cause me a specific kind of discomfort I had not anticipated. The vocabulary, the cadence, the particular way I tend to construct a long sentence. 7 years of proximity, of dinner table conversation, of reading correspondence I had sent in his presence. He had studied me the way a forger studies a signature. The letter described an elderly man increasingly isolated since the loss of his wife, who had concluded that the weight of his solitude had become more than he wished to carry. He prepared this at least 8 months ago, Reeves said. He was meticulous about it. I sat with that for a moment. The fog pressed against the windows. Yes, I said. He was. Patrick Callow's interrogation was a different matter entirely. He arrived in the room with a private attorney and the composed surface of someone who had been in difficult rooms before and knew how to be still in them. He denied everything systematically with the smooth patience of a man who had spent 15 years constructing denials from borrowed identities. Then Reeves said the name Eleanor Whitmore, and she placed the garden photograph on the table. The denial did not continue after that. Not because he admitted anything, but because the mask that Patrick Callow had worn under the name Sebastian Mercer, the mask that had sat across from me at breakfast and wished me luck at an auction and called me family, fell completely away, and what remained underneath was a silence that was not innocent. Scotland Yard called the Bureau 2 days later. The Whitmore inquiry was formally reopened. The extradition process began its slow, deliberate work through the Department of Justice. The trial was set for March. In the 4 months that followed, I watched my daughter do something I have since thought of as one of the most quietly courageous things I have ever witnessed. Every morning she went to her studio. Every morning she sat at the drafting table and drew. Not the elaborate layered pieces she had made before, simpler lines now. More considered proportions, shapes that seemed to be finding their own weight rather than reaching for something. As though she was learning from the beginning again what it meant to build something true. The trial lasted 11 days. I testified on the 4th, clearly and in sequence the way Monty had advised. The jury was out for 6 hours, 7 counts. Life without parole for Patrick Callow, 25 years for Dorian Laval. Renee Fontaine, whose cooperation had been complete, received a reduced sentence and deportation to Canada. Scotland Yard had already filed formal charges in the Whitmore case. Wherever Patrick Callow went from here, there was no direction that did not have a reckoning waiting at the end of it. I drove home from the courthouse alone. What I felt was not quite relief. Something quieter, the stillness that arrives when something that has been in motion for a long time finally comes to rest. Vivien filed for divorce the week after Sebastian's arrest, before the legal proceedings had even begun. She did not explain this to me, and I did not ask. She kept her name, her studio, and her drafting table. The pieces she made in the months that followed were different from anything before, simpler lines, more honest proportions, as though she was learning again to see clearly without anyone else's lens between her and the world. It takes the time it takes. I sold the house on Broadway in April. There were too many rooms that had become places where something had happened, and I had no interest in living inside a record of events. Edmund helped me sort what needed sorting quietly and without comment, and he drove the last truck himself. We went to Napa, a smaller property, a main house, a guest house, 6 acres of vineyard. Edmund took to the vines with the same focused attention he had given the roses for 30 years, and within 2 months, the place looked as though it had always been cared for that way. Some people carry their gift with them wherever they go. Edmund is one of those people. On an afternoon in June, I was sitting on the back terrace when Theo came running up from the lower vineyard, hair-tangled fist closed around something. 7 years old now, and recently determined that Agent 7 required a new operational sector in the Napa Valley region. He opened his hand. A small cluster of pale, unripe grapes. "Look what I found, grandfather." I looked at the grapes. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the blue velvet box. "Theo," I said, "I want to show you something." He went still in the way children do when they understand an adult is about to say something real. He watched me open the box, 3 stones in the June light, the sapphire pulling the light inward, the pearl quiet and luminous, the amber with its small, suspended bubble, the breath that had never been let out. I told him about Margaret, the sky in Chicago the day I met her, the pearl from her grandmother's necklace on our wedding day, the beach in Maine, where she had bent down and picked up a piece of amber and held it to the sun. He listened without moving. Then in French, quietly, "Was she beautiful, grandfather?" "She was the most beautiful thing I ever found," I said. "More valuable than any stone on this earth." He reached out and touched the amber with one small finger. Gently, the way you touch something you understand is precious. He lifted it toward the afternoon light, turning it slowly. "Someone trapped a piece of summer in here," he said. I did not tell him that those were her words, that she had said them on a beach 60 years ago, holding this same stone to a sky he would never see. He had found them himself. There are things that can be taken from you, and there are things that cannot, the ones that are real, that the years themselves made. Those can only be passed on. Theo held the amber in the Napa Valley sun and looked through it, and I let him look. I am not a man who speaks often about faith, but I will say this once and mean it completely. I do not believe a 6-year-old boy wanders into a garden at 2 a.m. and overhears the right conversation by accident. Some things are not coincidence. I have lived long enough to know the difference. This is my grandpa's stories, not the kind I would have chosen to tell. I made mistakes that nearly cost everything. I trusted too quickly, questioned too late, and let comfort replace caution for 7 years. If this family story teaches you anything, let it be this: do not wait for a crisis to truly know the people sitting at your table. Ask the questions you have been politely avoiding. The answers matter more than the comfort of not knowing. My personal belief is simple: loyalty is not proven in the good years. It is proven in the moments when everything is falling apart and someone still chooses to stand beside you. Edmund, Monty, Vivien, and a 7-year-old boy with a toy robot and the sharpest ears in his French class. These are the grandpa stories worth remembering. Not the diamonds, not the betrayal, but the people who held when it mattered. If this family story moved something in, you leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more grandpa stories like this, subscribing is the simplest thing you can do to make sure the next chapter finds you. Every family story deserves to be heard. Thank you for staying until the end of this one. And one more thing before you go, the stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted with care for the purpose of meaningful storytelling. If that is not the content you are looking for, this is a good moment to find what fits you better. No hard feelings, only good ones.